at this particular talk, I am going to set a context for painting snow and winter. I'm really talking about the Victorian winter and some of the artists who have painted scenes which might put a chill down the spine. Some paintings might be considered lightweight in art historical terms. Others are very strong and very dramatic and very moving paintings. But I felt it wise tonight to set some sort of context for this. I'm also going to be venturing across the Atlantic Ocean too, so I'm going to be looking at some winter paintings from the USA, or certainly actually from northern waters in north of Canada as well. So there are paintings that of scenes which take place well beyond the shores of Victorian Britain, and it's nice to see this sort of international context for some of this. Paintings of winter are intriguing because they have a strong psychological impact. Those of us who celebrate Christmas are slowly receiving Christmas cards right now, and and you will recognise one or two of these, I would think, for those of you who receive Christmas cards. You will recognise some of the paintings that I'm actually going to show you tonight, and it's rather odd sometimes thinking of them as art in quite the way that we think of, shall we say, some of the other Victorian paintings that I've shared with you over the course of this year. So I've entitled this talk "In the Bleak Midwinter." Let's just hopefully, here we are, we'll move on, right. And we're going to cover different aspects of art as well. So we will take a little foray into Victorian book illustration, narrative painting, landscape painting, and some of the themes that we've touched on already in my talks about art in the 19th century. So it's a really nice way of pulling together a lot of the things at the end of this year that I've been able to share with you in my talks on Victorian art and artists. So there'll be some familiar names, as Michael's already pointed out. The artist who I very often talk about, John Everett Millais, will be mentioned, but there'll be a few names who are maybe less familiar. But we start well before the Victorian period, and we go back to the 16th century. And to the famous peasant painter, Peter Bruegel the Elder. Now, I'm sure some of you will have received cards which would depict these, and some of you may have even been lucky enough to see some of Bruegel's marvellous paintings. Of course, they exist in many different forms. His son, Peter Bruegel the Younger, continued to work almost from the same templates, and there are in many cases 3 or 4 versions of the same scene or same painting. But they are quintessentially paintings that were highly influential upon any artist in the northern tradition who worked on wintry scenes. So I'm including them here because they do tie up right with a lot of our other paintings about winter. Bruegel, of course, takes this panoramic view of these Netherlandish villages, and he sets whatever the subject is, he sets it in a world that's very familiar to him. But it's the world of the common people, of the peasants. And this wonderful painting, The Census at Bethlehem, painted in the 1560s, was painted at a very tricky time in European history, as we well know, the Netherlands being occupied by Spanish forces. The great religious wars were taking place at this particular time, and it was very difficult as an artist who didn't work for the state to know exactly which way to take a painting. Bruegel opted for this position as a landscape painter, primarily a landscape painter. He did paint some religious subjects, or indeed even he managed to bring these contexts into his landscape painting. But he is essentially a painter with great human interest. There's lots of anecdote going on within it, and lots of local proverbs that need to be decoded within the paintings. But what is so wonderful about these paintings of winter by Pieter Bruegel is the sense of cold and of activity. And so the census of Bethlehem is of course from the gospel narrative. We see almost hidden are Mary and Joseph entering Bethlehem, as it were, in the middle foreground, but they are an incidental figures, really. There are others queuing up at the house where people are taking down the names for the census for the families. And of course, great interest in the Bruegel paintings are the skaters, the people throwing snowballs, the children playing, the peasants gathering sticks and making fires and keeping things going. Interestingly enough, there is often a red sun in these paintings, and that is because in the 1560s there was this red sun that appeared in the skies, and it was seen as a sort of divine omen. It was caused by atmospheric conditions, and also by the coming of what is known as the mini ice age as well. So we have these very severe northern winters in Flanders. And we also have this one by his son, but it was based on one of his paintings, the Massacre of the Innocents. And again, a painting that at first hand looks like a lovely winter scene with some horses and people in their fine clothing among the peasants, but it does in fact depict a horrific scene of the doors being broken down and the soldiers breaking in to get all the young boys from the town and massacre them. And of course it takes on this significance because the soldiers are in fact those from the Spanish Netherlands, and it is a comment upon things that are going on in Flanders at this particular time. So we will return to these paintings, but they are artistically and aesthetically a context, and are paintings that would be familiar to a number of Victorian artists. And although many of these ended up in collections in Spain and in Austria. This is a very famous one, Hunters in the Snow. And Bruegel here takes this wide panoramic view, looking across. He composes his landscapes. They are not, as some of the landscapes I'm going to show you today, necessarily accurate depictions of one scene, but they're amalgamations of places familiar, but it's a familiar world. But the world of the mountains in the background are probably those of the Dolomites, which Bruegel would have known about, but obviously living in low country, he wasn't he didn't live in the mountains, of course. So the scenes are a construct, and the hunters home are quite dejected in some way, and their dogs almost hang their heads, and they just seem to have caught a fox on one of the poles. But anyway, that's a marvelous winter painting. What I wanted to say about painting, and particularly comes out in Victorian paintings, is that the sense of season is this great sense of transformation that snow brings about in painting, so that the sky becomes darker than the land, and there is this sense of wonder. And of course, that is something that we sense whenever we see a snowfall, that the whole aspect of the landscape is transformed, and that's transformational aspect very much comes across in many of the great paintings of winter and the great artists who depict it. Now, our good friend John Ruskin, who I spoke about a few months ago now, was no great lover of Netherlandish art, as I think I previously pointed out. And he was quite critical of some of the Averkamp paintings that had arrived at the new National Gallery and National Collection as it was being set up. Avercamp's an interesting artist because he lives a little bit later than Bruegel, but he depicts again this world of ice fairs, of people playing on frozen rivers and in frozen landscapes. His things are full of incident and full of life, and you certainly get a chill down the back of your neck when you look at an Avercamp painting. Avercamp's an interesting artist because he was both deaf and dumb, and yet he rose to the very top of his profession in Holland. And his paintings are in many collections in both in Britain and obviously in the Low Countries, but they were known, and Ruskin certainly knew of some of these paintings. He was very disparaging about this type of painting. He felt that the subjects were not worthy of great art, and one of his great criticisms of particularly of 17th century art was that the subject matter was trivial and didn't aspire to some of the higher ideals that he felt landscape painting should really be dealing with. And certainly the peasant subjects did not appeal to John Ruskin. But anyway, he knew a number of these Avercamp paintings, and I've taken some photographs. One of my photographs there on the right of the Avercamp was taken in New York. During the Enlightenment, we get some very interesting snowbound and wintry paintings. This particular one, which is attributed to Henry Raeburn in the National Gallery of Scotland, is one of the most famous paintings in Britain now, and certainly considered one of the great paintings of the Enlightenment, the Reverend Robert Walker skating on the loch. Dated 1790. Now, its attribution has been taken, it's in question now whether it really is by Henry Raeburn, because it hadn't appeared in any inventory until comparatively modern times. But it is wonderfully painted and seems to be homage to Gilbert Stuart's painting of the skater of 10 years before. And we know Joshua Reynolds too, who set up the Royal Academy, of which many of the artists I'm going to show you belong to. He painted the winter. He unlike many artists of the Victorian period, he did not work direct from nature. Certainly he did not work plein air, and his landscape backgrounds, although quite wintry, were again a complete construct. So this little painting of Lady Caroline Scott from 1776 was a built-up landscape, an imagined landscape. But this type of painting became, these known as fancy pictures, became very, very influential upon Victorian painting, particularly later Victorian painting. And the scene too is rather yellowed because unfortunately Joshua Reynolds, unlike the great John Everett Millais and many of the great Victorian artists, used fugitive pigments and mixed his painting with bitumen and wax, and also a mastic varnish, which has caused a lot of Joshua Reynolds paintings to become discoloured. So the cheeks are unusually ruddy on Lady Caroline Scott. But I'm showing you these because these paintings were paintings that were ones cited when Victorian artists started to paint winter scenes. And one artist par excellence from the Romantic movement was Casper David Friedrich, who lived in the area of Schleswig-Holstein, in which part of northern Germany today. And his paintings are paintings which were highly influential upon many artists of the Romantic tradition. He, being an artist who could, through his paintings of winter and landscape, he could emphasize aspects of the human condition. And as you can see under there, this famous one of his called The Sea of Ice, we see the ship crushed in the Baltic ice flows and broken up. And this is referred to in a number of other paintings, and we particularly see this in the painting of Landseer that I'm going to show you in a little while. One of the other artists working at this particular time was Johann Christian Dahl, who paints these scenes in the northern part of Germany, this megalith grave in winter. Again, very much an artist who turned to paint winter in a very different way to the way we look at Bruegel. It's a very much an atmospheric paintings, and at the beginning of an understanding of colour and light within winter, and influenced by Goethe Goethe's colour theory as well. So I've talked a bit about Goethe in the past and what an influence he was too upon visual arts, and this plays out in the background of any artist who was looking and examining light and colour under wintry conditions. And so we come to the great J.M.W. Turner. And one of my favourite paintings, it falls out of the Victorian era, but it really does set the scene, as it were, is his lovely painting, a large painting, Frosty Morning, which is in Tate Britain in the Claw Gallery. And I find this an absolutely wonderful painting because it's a very daring painting too, because over half of the painting is really no more than streaks of grey and wispy, misty clouds, and yet it sums up that atmosphere of that wintry morning absolutely exquisitely. And Turner, although that would have been a studio painting, a very large painting, over 6 foot wide, he kept these lovely sketchbooks, which we're very fortunate to have, and which John Ruskin, of course, catalogued for the nation, and one of them includes this lovely little watercolor and body color of the kiln with fields under snow from his very early career there, and it was a credit to John Ruskin that he did catalogue all these early sketchbooks, which are so important, and for Turner the sketch was important to inform the later oil that came from it. So that is a wonderful painting, and if you don't live in Britain and you get the chance to go to the Tate Britain and the Claw Gallery, I do recommend this particular painting. Turner is perhaps better known for this sort of thing, though. In 1812, he painted this wonderful painting of the snowstorm, which is central to his theme, really, that the overwhelming forces of nature pitted against humanity. And this is ostensibly a painting Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. Note the date, 1812. It follows on from the equally famous painting by the classical painter Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon crossing the Alps. And of course, we know with Napoleon that he crossed the Alps following in Hannibal's footsteps, and this great painting by David became a great image of the 19th century, and indeed hung on many walls in the versions of mezzotints and prints. And there were 5 versions of this amazing painting by David based on a sarcophagus, a Roman sarcophagus, and Napoleon is depicted as a great hero. And if you notice in the rocks on the alpine landscape there, one says Bonaparte, and the other rock just going out of the frame, it says Hannibal, and so it is equating Napoleon's crossing with that of Hannibal's. But a more reflective view came up in the 1850s from the great French artist Paul Delaroche, who was a very influential artist on a lot of Victorian painters, British Victorian painters. He painted things like the young princes in the Tower, and many subjects that Lady Jane Grey, which is in the national collection here. So Paul Delaroche is a much more reflective version of Napoleon crossing the Alps, far less heroic, and of course reflects upon the outcome of the Napoleonic age, 1850. So that's a later reflection and a painting that was well known to many of the artists of the Victorian era. But we come at this season of winter and Christmas, and I couldn't let this pass without referring to perhaps someone who did so much to construct our, shall we say, our view of Christmas, or a Victorian Christmas, and the Christmas Carol, published in 1843. And I've picked for my link with Dickens today quite an unusual painting from the illustrator Robert William Buss. Now, he illustrated plenty of work by Dickens. He was a fine illustrator of Pickwick Papers. But he comes up with this painting 5 years after Dickens' death, and this painting, called Dickens' Dream, is a marvellous painting in a way, because it sums up incidents from Dickens' work, and particularly Christmas Carol. And it's almost a modern painting in some ways. We see the author at Gad's Hill sitting, falling into a reverie and thinking about, rather like A Christmas Carol, he falls into a dream, and the subjects from his many, particularly from Pickwick Papers and A Christmas Carol, appear before him almost as a hallucination. So I would consider this a great Victorian winter painting, and it's dated 1875. So as I say, it's after Dickens has died, but it's a reflection upon, and it was in the last year of William Buss's life as well. So he was an illustrator of the earlier Victorian period, but a fine illustrator, and one who is partially overlooked these days, but they're charming illustrations. They're somewhat similar in some respect to John Tenniel's illustrations. And in the Ashmolean Museum, we have this rather seasonal painting, Henry Braithwaite Martineau's The Poor Actress's Christmas Dinner, rather reflecting that lovely plum pudding from the life and times of Bob Cratchit. Now, this painting was never actually finished, so it's quite an interesting painting for us who are artists, because it actually shows how a pre-Raphaelite painting was built up. That is that they are constructed piecemeal, that you work on one section. You don't work like a turner all over the canvas and gradually build up the surface. It is built on in parts. And so Braithwaite Martineau has finished his Christmas plum pudding there on the plate, but the plate is hardly finished. The actress's head is finished, but not much else is finished. And we don't know exactly why this painting was abandoned. Braithwaite Martineau was a friend of Holman Hunt, and he also acted as a studio assistant as well at times. And he's a fine painter in the pre-Raphaelite style. But that's one of his paintings, and that is often on display at Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, and they obviously use it these days as a Christmas card as well. So it's quite a nice little painting. But you can see the white ground that the pre-Raphaelites preferred. They didn't work on a stained ground favoured by artists like Joshua Reynolds from the century before. But here we come to the link with the title of my talk this evening, and that is Dante Gabriel Rossetti's sister, Christina Georgina Rossetti. And now she was born in 1830 and lived to 1894. And she was a very sensitive young woman. She is, I'm sure she is worthy of a talk all about her poetry. Particularly we think of things like The Goblin Market, and we obviously think of her religious verses. She was a devout Christian. She initially was attracted by high Anglicanism and Catholicism. She was actually engaged to the pre-Raphaelite brother James Collinson for one period. I may have mentioned that James Collinson was the one pre-Raphaelite who resigned from pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood after painting 2 or 3 paintings. He found Millet's Christ in the Carpenter's Shop. The controversy surrounding that he thought had brought some sort of disrepute upon the group, and it troubled him as a devout Christian. So he actually left the group. But that is a painting by James Collinson. At the time, he was romantically linked with Christina Rossetti. So it's interesting that those two and Rossetti, the Rossettis were very good friends at the time. I have to say that Dante Gabriel Rossetti, although from a Catholic background, was far from devoutly religious. He certainly wasn't. But Christina Rossetti was a poet of extraordinary power. And we know her work now, particularly in a couple of very very well-known hymns. Love Came Down at Christmas and in the Bleak Midwinter, which was initially titled A Christmas Carol. And there it is in its first publication on the right. Also, I was this painting, which I've shown you before, the Annunciation, painted by Dante Gabriel Rossetti as a pre-Raphaelite, actually features Christina Rossetti as the model of the Virgin Mary. and there is the angel Gabriel announcing to Mary the coming of Christ. And it was a very radical painting because it had minimal color, and it obviously was very, very shocking to the Victorian art world in that it had skewed and archaic perspective and seemed to look back over 400 years to a former style, and yet it had a certain power to it that was to press the way forward and pointed to other things that were going to happen in Victorian art later on, like aestheticism. So we have the primary colours emphasised here, the red background to the tapestry of the lilies that the Virgin is weaving. We have the blue background symbolising heaven behind her head, and the open window. But the cell nature of it too is very, very interesting. Rossetti had great problems with painting the flames on the angel Gabriel's feet, and I never think he successfully achieved that, but he would consult with Holman Hunt on that particular point. But again, a marvelous painting, but this was the last publicly exhibited painting by him as a pre-Raphaelite. After that, because of the criticism he received from this particular painting, he always exhibited privately right up to the end of his life, and very successfully so. It was a good strategy, but certainly he failed. He didn't test the waters again with public exhibition in quite that way. But his painting is in the Tate Britain and a fine piece of painting, and obviously allied to the other great pre-Raphaelite works of the other pre-Raphaelite brothers at this period. But Rossetti didn't give up altogether painting Christian paintings of a seasonal nature. This one is in Llandaff Cathedral, just outside Cardiff in Wales. And this one comes from 10 years later. He did paint an earlier version on it, and this is known as The Seed of David, which features David, the shepherd boy. There he is, out in the fields with his slingshot, possibly before Goliath. Then we have the central panel, which is of the Nativity taking place in the stable, and quite traditional in some ways, but reliant upon Flemish art, and particularly artists like Rogier van der Weyden and other Northern Renaissance artists, particularly important in that one. And then I'm afraid in my photograph, which it was very difficult light conditions, we have David as king. In the right-hand panel, and there he sits with his lyre or harp on his lap. So it's a lovely painting that Dante Gabriel Rossetti, in his progression as a pre-Raphaelite, continued to paint in this style. He became ever more sophisticated, and of course his paintings, I would say the Virgin in this particular central panel is in fact Jane Morris, and I've often talked about Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Jane Morris in my talks. But so I thought you might like to see that particular painting. I don't know if they do it as a Christmas card, but it's a marvelous piece of painting. It's in a side chapel at Llandaff Cathedral. And here we have another nativity painting, again inspired by Christina Rossetti, from another pre-Raphaelite artist who wasn't actually a member of the Brotherhood, but he was a very good friend of the pre-Raphaelite brothers, and that is the young Arthur Hughes. And he was a wonderful painter, and this is a very tender painting of the Nativity painted by him, and it almost echoes the carol in the Bleak Midwinter. It has this wonderful quality to it, and we see the tenderness of and a very young Mary there as well, which was probably more true to the biblical account than some of the Marys that we get in some of the other paintings. So he's been very pre-Raphaelite about it, and a wonderful little painting that is. Another painting or a drawing of Christina Rossetti here by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. He always stood up for his sister, and there she is as the poet, and a lovely charcoal and sanguine drawing of her as a mature woman. So some years after her painting as Mary the Virgin. And of course, it isn't just Christmas that is at this time of the year. It is also, for the Pre-Raphaelites, it was an auspicious time too, because this poem by John Keats, The Eve of St. Agnes, was of particular significance to so many Pre-Raphaelite artists. It falls on the 20th of January, the Eve of St. Agnes, and we know it is described fully in the poem by John Keats, and later elaborated on by Alfred Lord Tennyson. But these lovely paintings here, this one here is again in Tate Britain, a marvelous triptych by Arthur Hughes, the artist who I showed you painted the nativity scene. And there we have the flight of the lovers leaving. It's all under moonlight. It's a very and look at the gorgeous frame to this particular Eve of St. Agnes here. So the frame actually becomes part of the work, and Keats's poetry is actually painted onto the frame itself. But it echoes very much the very first Pre-Raphaelite painting by William Holman Hunt that I showed on my talk by Hunt, and it's the Flight of Madeleine. And you can see the drunken stewards on the ground. And this was the first radical Pre-Raphaelite painting, painted in 1848, and it's in the Guildhall Art Gallery in London. And it was the sort of the announcement that there was something, a very, very new movement. And of course, it is the severe foreshortening of the steward, which echoes the Uccello painting of the Battle of San Romano, and a wonderful colour too that was beginning to appear in paintings by William Holman Hunt. But Millet also returned to the painting The Eve of St. Agnes. In 1863, he paints his wife Effie as Madeleine undressing in the great rooms at Knowle Palace in Kent. And that is a painting where Millet has now moved out of the Pre-Raphaelite style into a more aesthetic style, where he's painting in a broader brush strokes, but still with beautiful moonlit colour. It's often known, this painting was criticised for its gridiron effect upon Madeleine through the windows. The moonlit effect sort of made a gridiron across her dress, but I think that actually gives the sort of space to the actual painting. It is a marvellous painting. It's in the Royal Collection and in Clarence House in London. Fortunately, we were able to see it about 10 years ago for the main Millet exhibition. It is a shame, though, that we can't see it more regularly, because it's a fine piece of painting. William Holman Hunt, too, of course, at this time, he also, as a Pre-Raphaelite, he moved on, as we know, into he never abandoned Pre-Raphaelitism, but it almost became more intense. And at this time of year, of course, we think of the Gospel accounts and the story of the Massacre of the Innocents. So we go back to the Bruegel painting again with the Massacre of the Innocents, but to Victorians, this painting took on greater significance because of infant mortality, which is almost the universal experience of all Victorian families. And so Holman Hunt broadens not just the biblical story here about the innocents following Christ and Mary and Joseph as they flee to Egypt from Herod, but it is the resurrected innocents there appearing following as in a procession, in a triumphal procession, following Jesus and Mary into the desert at Gaza. And Holman Hunt painted this particular painting in what is now the Gaza Strip, and he painted it by a wadi there, and there's a well in the background, and it's full of Christian iconography. And Holman Hunt battled with this painting over many years. In fact, there's 3 versions of it, because the canvas went wrong, something he bought in Palestine. The canvas became warped, so he repainted it and relined it. He painted it a number of times. It is a curious painting in many ways, because it has these enormous bubbles appearing from the stream, and these illuminate other passages from the Bible. But this painting doesn't regularly make it into Christmas cards, but it is part of the feast of the Holy Innocents, part of this Christmas winter period, and also very much possess the Victorian imagination. And a fine painting it is in many ways too. And he went through great difficulties painting these young children. And being Holman Hunt, he didn't use photographs. He worked from the live model, and he went under extraordinary difficulties to get what he thought was a great veracity to nature. Or it has to be said that sometimes his paintings, as a result, look distinctly odd, and this would be one of them. There's a great version of this at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, and the other one is in Tate Britain, but I'd say is rarely hung in Tate Britain. I've only, in my last 40 years, I've only seen it about twice on the wall in Tate Britain. Large painting. One of the great artists of the Victorian period was, of course, beloved of Queen Victoria, was Sir Edwin Landseer. We know him particularly for the lions at the base of Nelson's Column, where he broke out from being just a painter to being a sculptor as well. But nobody has ever, since Stubbs, painted animals in quite the way that Landseer painted animals. And this is a winter painting, and this is Alpine Mastiffs reanimating a distressed traveller. And there we can see the St. Bernard dogs with their great barrel of brandy around their necks, licking and reviving this traveller who's fallen probably in the St. Gothard Pass, beloved of Turner, and there he is being brought back to life. And so a powerful painting by Landseer there. And then there's another one which has this great sense of winter to it, and this is his great coming events cast their shadow before them. Landseer's paintings always have this allegorical sense to them. They're not just sentimental paintings of animals, but they follow in a romantic tradition right back to the great romantic artists. And yet he is an artist who can paint animals both realistically, but he has this sort of this anthropomorphic sense about them too. So he is one of the great artists of the Victorian era, and I very much hope I can give you a talk next year about Edwin Landseer, because I think he is an artist who should be very much reconsidered. An artist who I talked about a few weeks ago was Frederick Edwin Church, and you might remember that I showed you his painting, painted in Ecuador, Cotopaxi, of the eruption of the volcano in the south, and how that painting had links with the coming of the great American Civil War. But he did paint one which was about the North, and that was a couple of years before. He painted this one called the Icebergs, or the North. In fact, he retitled it the Icebergs because he didn't want it associated with the idea of this being the Yankee and the Confederates. So he retitled the painting, but the painting was about this extraordinary landscape of northern Canada, of Baffin Bay, and here he paints winter like no other artist. So you might remember, if you were at my talk on American landscape painting, he painted Niagara Falls. He was an artist very much influenced by Turner and the sublime, and here he paints, there's nothing more sublime than these enormous castles of ice and the ice flows of the north, and he paints them with great attention to detail, great veracity, in only the way that Edwin Church could paint these things. But it was painted at a time when, after the failure of Lord Franklin's expedition and the lost crew of Franklin to discover the Northwest Passage, so we can see the crushed mast of a craft in a northern West Passage there in under the iceberg. And that brings us to this painting of 1874 from England by John Everett Millais, the Northwest Passage, featuring an old sea dog. And here he is looking at his old sea charts and ruminating on the idea that it might be possible to find this Northwest Passage that had eluded Franklin and had eluded so many to seek it. And so in this painting, we have the sea dog seated with his daughter, and as she reads to him about his previous voyages. And he is, of course, resolved that one day England, particularly, it's a very patriotic painting because you can see Nelson is behind him in the print behind him, will discover this Northwest Passage and then open up the whole of the breadbasket of the great plains to trade. And we can see in the background the open sea, a window which looks remarkably like a Whistler painting, and that's very, very true. In a lot of Millet's sparring with Whistler all the time, he has a glass of grog on the side there. He has his old sea charts there. It's almost as if his daughter's dress is almost like the waves of the sea too. So that is pretty deliberate from Millet there. And in the background, you might even see a painting of icebergs and ice flows on the wall. So all of those things are being commented on in this painting. It's a large painting, possibly a painting that will not be hung so often in the Tate Gallery these days with all concerns about the British Empire. But it's a painting that is an important late painting by John Everett Millet. And now we come back to Landseer, and this is another painting that almost echoes the church painting, this famous painting called Man Proposes, God Disposes. Now, Landseer was a man subject to severe mental illness, and throughout his life, he was very, very troubled by these episodes of depression and severe depression. And so we could say this painting has something of a great pessimism about it in a way, but it does echo the lines from Tennyson's In Memoriam about nature being red in tooth and claw, and it does ruminate upon whether God is benevolent or all-loving. Ruminated upon, obviously, in Landseer's great poem to his friend Arthur Hallam. This painting was painted in 1864, so some years after In Memoriam, but the painting itself depicts two polar bears ripping apart this broken masted ship. You can see the telescope on the ground on the left, and you can see the bones, possibly not human bones, we don't know. They may be the bones of one of the ponies that were taken on these expeditions, but it again reflects that concern about the loss of the Franklin expedition of 1845, and Lady Franklin, who put out this enormous reward to discover her husband. And of course, there's a famous, now what we would call a folk song called Lord Franklin, which is all composed about this whole period. And she spent no end of time to recover whereabouts of her long lost Franklin. And so some of these Victorian paintings are concerned with this with this lost expedition, but also prompted to make patriotic efforts to discover this Northwest Passage and indeed to expand empire and a hold of empire. And of course, Tennyson inspires so many artists at this time. And the late Millet landscape, which could be considered a winter landscape, is his painting Dew-Drenched Firs, which is in the Tate Britain again, and was inspired by In Memoriam, but in a very different way to the way Landseer was inspired by that. And there's an earlier painting inspired by Tennyson, Mariana of the Moated Grange. And of course, Millet was an illustrator to the Moxon Tennyson of 1857, and he painted this fine portrait of Alfred Lord Tennyson in 1881, which hangs in the Lady Lever Art Gallery near Liverpool. And I would recommend that museum if you're interested in Victorian art. The Lady Lever Art Gallery near Liverpool is one of the finest museums for Victorian painting that there is in Britain. The Honourable John Collier, a great artist of the later part of the Victorian era, a frequent exhibitor at the Royal Academy, also again looks rather like the Landseer painting. It looks to an earlier voyage, this one of Henry Hudson, which ended again in disaster. And here Henry Hudson's frozen hand is upon the tiller. The sailor in the bottom left is probably dead, his glassy stare lying against the boat among the ice floes. And the pose of Henry Hudson was commented upon at the time and seems to have been based on Joshua Reynolds' well-known painting of Eugenio from Dante's Inferno. And those of you who may know the Dante's Inferno know that this Eugenio was the children were offered themselves to be eaten so he wouldn't starve. So it's the idea that there's a sort of darker side to this Collier painting too, that cannibalism may be the only way to survive, and it brings about all these dreadful sort of human dilemmas put under such great pressures in these vast snowy wastes of the north. And Landseer, again in this A Winter Landscape with Sheltering Figures, also reflects upon this too. So Victorian painting isn't all sweet Christmas card scenes. They deal with some very, very deep subjects about empire, subjects even concerning cannibalism, because as we know, when the Franklin crew were discovered, that there were signs that there had been cannibalism upon some of the seamen who were discovered in the ice, that the bones had been gnawed, and they were not polar bear gnawings of bones. They're probably humans. So it's a very dark passage, and so Collier's painting links with that. Let me move on. Okay, but we go across the English Channel, and we come to just something a little bit more simple, a landscape by Gustaf Corby. But he was an artist who throughout his career painted, he was known, obviously a realist and a precursor of the Impressionist, and also a very great influence on James McNeill Whistler, who spent much of his career in London, and Whistler knew Corby, but Whistler Corby brought out a whole new way of painting, and he painted with a palette knife, and particularly these wintry landscapes painted with a palette knife were led to a great revolution in snowy paintings in the Victorian era. Sort of mediated through artists like Whistler, of course. Guy de Maupassant recounts a visit to Corby's studio, and he says in a huge empty room, a fat, dirty, greasy man was slapping white paint on a blank canvas with a kitchen knife, and that was Gustaf Corby. And there is that fat, greasy man there of 1861, and there is Whistler's Symphony in White of a similar period. So the paintings of winter by Corby were highly influential on so many artists in the later part of the 19th century, and some of them are very lovely. Some of the hunting scenes too you get a chill about them, because he is a realist. He's an artist who's really interested in what the light of winter and the effects of winter. And there's one of his ones. I think this one particularly actually harks back to the Bruegel painting in some ways. We're looking at poachers in the snow, hunters in the snow, and you can see the poachers with their dogs, similar in so many ways, and yet obviously unlike it in that. And Corby wasn't interested in symbolism in the way that the pre-Raphaelites were, or artists of the English school were. And the great Claude Monet had come to London, as we know, in 1872. But before that, a couple of years before, he painted this absolutely marvelous painting known as the Magpie in 1869, which really shows this new understanding of light and colour and coloured shadows within snow. Partly influenced by Chevreul's theories on colour and the colour wheel, also Goethe's colour theory, and so snow was now enlivened in painting, and it became a very real subject. And for Claude Monet, it was one that he went outside and painted outside in the snow, and this was something many Victorian artists were beginning to do, working outside and working direct from nature. we don't get many pre-Raphaelite paintings in the snow, of course, because they work so slowly that they would have, and snow being ephemeral, it wouldn't have been possible probably for them to paint a pre-Raphaelite painting in the snow in quite this way. We do have winter paintings, and there we have it. I have a little detail there from a Bruegel painting. So perhaps there's even something in Monet's mind that we do see birds more clearly against the snowy sky. And that is one of the most marvelous paintings of winter, and probably you've had that as a Christmas card at some time. Whistler's grey and gold snow in Chelsea near his home at Cheyne Walk. And Whistler's snowy landscapes and Thameside landscapes, and I'm going to be talking on Whistler next year, partly thanks to not just his new manner of painting with very deft brush strokes, almost eliminating anything. You don't get anything of Courbet in Whistler, in the later Whistlers. You don't get any vigorous pieces of impasto or anything like that. They're very thinly painted paintings, as in this one of grey and gold in the snow. But Whistler was somewhat fascinated, as were many other Impressionist artists, by the dreadful atmospheric conditions in London in the 1860s and 70s and 80s. The great stink, of course, we know of, and cleared up to some extent by Joseph Bazalgette's new the new sewers that were put into London. But the murky conditions really had a great effect upon Whistler's form of Impressionism, and this particular painting really depicts that sort of wintry, smoggy atmosphere of London during this period of Victorian England, which was absolutely deadly. That was why so many just tried to avoid the streets at certain times when you had these dreadful smogs come upon London. But Whistler here paints this lovely little painting close to his home at Cheyne Walk. And I think it kind of echoes a later photograph by Steichen of the Flatiron Building in New York, a very famous photograph by Steichen. But you get that kind of light in Whistler's paintings, and no doubt Steichen was very much influenced by a lot of Whistler's painting. And a painting of a similar period just across the channel. A Winter Day in Brussels, 1887, by a Belgian artist, Frans Galliard, an artist who was very much influenced by the advent of photography. Now, at first glance, you might think, well, there's nothing unusual about this painting, but as an artist, you look at this painting and think, there are some perspective type anomalies that you get only if you use a camera. And that is, if you look at the size of that dog there, it's far too large on that picture plane, and it must be as a result of a photographic sort of effect that you get. And so rather an odd painting in some ways, but that's by the Royal Park in Brussels. Those of you who know the Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels, just across the way from here, a very recognisable scene. In a sense, quite a lovely painting. But it does emphasise also what was interesting to artists at this period. Winter brought about the great winter fashions of the period, and no greater artist of the Victorian era was the Frenchman James Joseph Tissot, a friend of Edouard Manet, who came to reside in London following the Paris Commune of 1872. And he comes to live with his mistress in London, Mrs. Newton, and they take up residence near Holland Park, and he paints these wonderful fashionable paintings of Mrs. Newton, and in all the latest Parisian fashions, but against the snowy background. So these are another form of aestheticism, different to Whistler's, but there's no doubt about it. They're paintings about beauty, much despised by Ruskin, who felt that they were no more than hand-painted or hand-tinted colour photographs. But at the same time, we have our good friends William Morris and Burne-Jones, who we've talked about quite a bit over this past year. And here is a lovely window that William Morris made, entitled Winter, which was to be put at Cragside in Northumberland for the Armstrong family home No expense spared, of course. The Armstrong, who had made the money from munitions up in the northeast, and this is a marvelous building, Cragside. He had all the finest painters and artists of the Victorian era until he went himself into a period of bankruptcy in 1875. But he commissioned these windows, and there's this lovely window called Winter by William Morris, in the pre-Raphaelite style, and that's an early Morris window, so a very, very important early William Morris window there. And there is also a lovely painting by Burne-Jones entitled Winter, and that one there is quintessentially Burne-Jones. You can see the wintry tree behind. All of these ones are part, obviously, of a seasonal piece. So you have all the seasons, and each window depicts a different season, or each painting depicts a different season, as indeed do the Bruegel paintings. They are seasonal paintings. And that's also the other Kelmscott house in Hammersmith, which is the home of William Morris and the William Morris Society. A very interesting place. And in some respects, more interesting than Kelmscott House in Oxfordshire, because it has lots of the archive here at this particular house in Hammersmith. and I would be amiss if I didn't touch upon Victorian illustration of this period and the lovely engravings by the Dalziel brothers, and they were able to translate these woodblock engravings of snow. This lovely one here, Winter Song. You can see there's this sort of thing that appears in Good Words and in a lot of the Cornhill magazines of the period. We have these lovely woodblock illustrations. This one by Frederick Sands, The Little Mourner, based on Millet's The Vale of Rest, but they're not just shoveling dirt, but shoveling snow as well. So you have the snowy graveyard in the background, beautifully a woodblock, full of power. And we must look at these Victorian wood engravings sometimes, particularly of the 1860s. It was a really wonderful period for these illustrators. And also we have here one of the great artists of the Victorian period. You probably know his Lady of Shalott. What might be less known is this rather wintry scene here. John William Waterhouse painting Saint Eulalia from 1885. Now she, according to the legend, when she, after being martyred, you can see the cross there in the Forum at Rome, is on the ground, and then there was a miraculous snowfall upon her, and so they're lying on the ground, surrounded by the pigeons and doves. And you can see the Roman centurion walking about. Very much a typical painting of this. You have painters like Alma Tadema, but he never painted in the snow in quite the way that William Waterhouse did. And this too has dramatic foreshortening as well. So our focus is upon the birds as well, and it elucidates this particular legend of her martyrdom. And I have also shown too how this magical snow period, this transformational aspect of snow in art, also in this Millet one of St Agnes Eve here, this wood engraving for the Moxon Tennyson, and I've done a little enlargement here, very much enlargement. You can see how, look at the breath upon the night sky there, how beautifully that's engraved. And the Dalziel brothers, although often complained about by Dante, Gabriel, Rossetti, were marvelous wood engravers, and they did translate these wooden blocks beautifully and produce these memorable illustrations to Tennyson. And back in Paris, we have this I'm pointing up a difference, a widely opening gap really between what was happening in French art at the time and British art. So we have Paul Siniak, a pointillist artist, using these little dots and points of colour, rather like Seurat's paintings that you will probably know about. Here he is painting in Paris in 1886 with his wonderful wintry effects, of course, that you're getting in that painting, but equally you've got a sense of winter in this Logsdale painting of St Martin in the Fields, 1888. But as we can see, it's far more reliant upon photography, upon general atmosphere, and a much more much less avant-garde painting, much more acceptable probably to the Victorian picture-buying public. But again, an interesting painting in the relationship between photography and painting of this particular period. And if we cross the Atlantic again, and an artist I mentioned on my talk on landscape painting and American art of the late 19th century, Charles Hassam, who painted those wonderful flag paintings. He also painted some marvelous wintry paintings in New York City. And they're very, very interesting in many ways, because he's quite interested in snow that has been turned into slush by trams and horses, and so he likes the sort of all the marks upon the ground that is in the snow. And they're very different impressionist, American impressionist sort of paintings. So don't just believe that all the impressionists were French. Some were American, and he is a marvelous painter of this late end of the century feel. And in the New English Art Club, we had George Clawson, who does this, you don't have to have snow to have winter, and he paints this lovely wintry scene, winter work. It's sort of homage to Jean-François Millet, the Barbizon painter of 1856, but it's also a new type of painting that concerns itself with the rural poor. And we think of Hubert von Herkomer, who also paints these social realist paintings at this particular time. And George Clawson is also influenced by Bastien Lafarge, whose paintings very often are about the rural poor. And so these paintings are, in a way, sort of allied to the paintings of a century before of the fancy pictures of Gainsborough, but they don't take pity on the poor, rather they ennoble poor people and working people's work. So they have a new, almost socialist intent to them. And this is another strand that's coming out in late Victorian art, and an interesting one too. Couldn't do paintings in winter in Victorian art if I didn't once again mention the wonderful contribution of Benjamin Leader's paintings. His best known painting in Birmingham City Art Gallery, February Phildyke of 1881, obviously takes the whole the pathos of the end of the day, the weary peasants wandering back to their little cottage, sort of idyllic scenes, the reflections, but they are large paintings. They're painting 6-foot paintings. They echo to some extent the work of John Constable, but they also have something of the pathetic fallacy, that is the sky echoing human sentiment. And so we can say a lot of late Victorian paintings, as we know, have this almost sentimental feel to them too, about them, which was so criticised by Ruskin in some ways, but he sees this as a great fall from some of the great late landscapes of Turner. But they have a peculiar beauty about them, and anybody who's walked around in the Midlands in the winter will be very familiar with this particular type of scene, and flooded field edges were a great speciality of Benjamin Leader. As indeed wintry landscapes were of the self-taught artist John Atkinson Grimshaw, who lived in Leeds, near Nostrop Hall in Leeds, and he was a very, very successful painter, one who greatly indebted to the Pre-Raphaelite movement, but not actually a Pre-Raphaelite. He was also greatly indebted to the world of photography, and his art at times comes very close to mimicking the daguerreotypes of the period, and even to the extent that he was accused of actually painting over photographs. He certainly used what's called a camera obscura in his paintings, that is a darkened room with an oculus which projects an image upon a canvas, and then you trace that image. So he was able to overcome some of his shortcomings in perspective by actually tracing some of these architectural scenes. But there's no doubt about it, he could capture the atmosphere of a northern town very, very well. And anybody who walks around Headingley and Leeds nowadays will recognise some of these lovely, lovely houses and buildings, and the atmospheric northern light. And Atkinson Grimshaw came down to London, and Whistler even complimented him upon his paintings. He said that he wasn't the only painter of nocturnes in London, that there was this John Atkinson Grimshaw. So he was thought of as an artist of some considerable importance at the time. And he paints things that can be quite ghostly. And I've actually seen that some of his paintings have been used for book jackets of ghost stories. And you see that actually in his work. And there's one called A Yorkshire Home, which was used and appropriated as such. And I suppose this time of the year is the dark time of the year when we gather around the fire and tell stories. And there's the Millet illustration of the Christmas storytelling. But there's also, it's the time of the year when people very often tell ghost stories. And there is a very peculiar painting by Millet called The Grey Lady of 1883, which was actually a first version of his Princes in the Tower, but he realized he painted the towers of London staircase round the wrong way, having painted it from a tower up in Burnham in near Dunkeld, and so he paints this spectral ghostly woman, almost again mimicking a sort of Whistler's brush marks in that one. And Millet then embarks upon his first winter landscape in 1887. Very large painting, 6 foot high, painted at Merthley Castle, his famous hunting ground. He took out with the Fotheringham family. He took a lease on a place called Burnham Hall, just in the Merthley estate, and that is Merthley Castle. Just on Christmas Eve, he finished the painting. That's why it's titled Christmas Eve. But it looks to the old castle at Merthley, so familiar to him. He had painted it. He painted it the following year. He painted the formal gardens there. And this scene is in the snow, and like Monet, he painted out in the snow. He had a little hut constructed for the purpose and painted faithfully this unusual upright landscape. So it was quite innovative at the time, not in a pre-Raphaelite style anymore, quite broadly painted, but again fastidious in his looking at nature and analysing colour. He had a go at it before in 1884 when he painted this painting known as the Mistletoe Gatherer, which is more like a Bouguereau painting of a young woman. But the background, definitely the landscape portion, is a Scotch landscape, and one that he would have been familiar with from his sojourns in Scotland. Millet would then return down to London in January and then embark upon a busy year again of portraiture and subject paintings. But so landscapes for him were serious, and they're wonderful landscapes, but they were part of his life, partly recreational as well. And the last landscape he ever painted was this "Blow, blow, thou winter wind, thou art not so unkind as man's ingratitude," taken from the song in As You Like It. It's an unusual landscape for Millet in that it has a sort of narrative to it as well. And one of them that we've actually touched upon in our talks about Victorian England, and that is the subject of the fallen woman. Unfortunately, the woman there being abandoned, you can see her with her little pack on the ground, her child nestled into her cape, and the man wandering off into the distance, and the dog howling against the storm-blasted tree. Now, this is a real landscape. This was painted at Causey Hill near Bowerswell, the Gray family home, Effie's family home, where many years before she had married John Ruskin, and later she married John Everett Millet. So it's a landscape that's very familiar to him. It's on Causey Hill, just on the side of Kinnoul Hill. And this painting is now in the National Gallery in Auckland in New Zealand. But we fortunately had it back here in England about 10 years ago for an exhibition. So I have actually seen this one, and this is a direct photograph from that one. The other great winter painting of Millet's is in Manchester City Art Gallery, and it's called Glen Burnham, also painted, as it would suggest, by Burnham Wood near Dunkeld. And it features an old woman walking down this track, which is in fact now quite a main road going to Dunkeld from Perth. So you would be run over if you actually stood in that position these days. But it's a wonderful painting. It's got Burnham Hill in the background. And it also features what we know in the history of art as the Rücken figure, particularly in Friedrich's art. You have a figure as seen from behind wandering forward. And we get that particularly in a lot of the romantic paintings of Friedrich, where you get figures contemplating the landscape, and then we contemplate them, and it sets up this dynamic within the painting. And Millet does this in his own painting. It was allied, actually. He had this painting, Glen Burnham of 1890, was sort of twinned with another painting called Lingering Autumn, which featured a young girl carrying a pail of water across a stream in late autumn. So we had one of youth and one of age. So there is a sort of parallel within those two paintings. And it's echoed also in this painting, The Lost Path, by Frederick Walker, an artist who sadly left us far too early. He was an artist of very, very great promise, an illustrator for the Graphic magazine, but he also was a great painter too. And one can see something of the Millet. He was a friend of Frederick Walker and a great admirer of Frederick Walker. So possibly something of that comes into the Millet paintings too. It's always the case in art that artists appropriate other artists' work if they like them, and great artists steal, as Paul Gauguin once said. There's another painting, a wintry painting by Frederick Walker, The Vagrants, again a social realist subject of 1868. And there's an example of Walker's illustration for The Woman in White. And that's a lovely one, an illustration of his. So he was a very talented artist who unfortunately died at a young age, and so he never fulfilled his full promise, really. But Hubert van Herkomer also has this social realist aspect, and he is obsessed with the working poor. And so there's a lovely drawing there that he did, gathering fuel. And then we have the other great Victorian artist, Frank Hole, painting Winter, very much in that social realist style. And then this lovely painting at Manchester City Art Gallery, Hard Times, which shows the Irish labourers who are he's out of work, but he is not going to be beaten down by it. He is looking for his next job. And so it's a hopeful painting, and it shows the dignity of human labor. So rather than there's the woman beside the road here is exhausted, but the family are going to find more work. And Herkomer is a great social realist artist, a socialist who is, he paints the famous painting On Strike. So we have the beginnings of the labor movement happening here, and being illustrated in the social realist work of Hubert van Herkomer, very, very important artist of the later Victorian period, and an influence upon the young Vincent Van Gogh, I may add. I'm sure most of us who receive Christmas cards will have received this one at some point in time. Joseph Farquharson's The Shortening Winter's Day is Near a Close. And this is just outside of the period, but he painted in the Victorian period. And his paintings are quite formulaic. He was from Aberdeen, but he paints these scenes, and there we are. He paints these scenes, and there's his own Lost Path himself, that lower painting in lower right-hand corner. But he paints these wintry scenes of winter shadows and low sunlight very, very wonderfully well. But he must have painted hundreds of these things because they were so successful, and they still are as Christmas cards. People enjoy that type of painting. And Anton Mauve over in the Hague School in Holland, a great influence upon the young Vincent van Gogh and a distant relation of his, paints Good Day Snowstorm in 1878. And we remember that the young Vincent van Gogh came to work in London for Goupil's. And so he also was in correspondence with Anton Mauve. And we can see, here is an Anton Mauve painting, which gives an example of his, of a 1870s winter, and fearsome it looks too. And there is Vincent van Gogh himself going to the south of France in 1888 to paint his Japan of the South, but on his arrival he finds this very, very heavy snowfall. Very unusual for the south of France to do that, but being Vincent van Gogh and a man who never lets up any opportunity to paint or to draw, he actually creates this modern masterpiece of Arles in the Snow in 1888, influenced by the Japanese prints, and we know many British artists also were very interested in the art of the Orient and Japanese prints. And of course we have so many of these paintings from the late Victorian era. They're by forgotten artists today. This is by McCallum, It's known as Silvery Moments, Burnham Beeches from Buckinghamshire. And these paintings in the art world are rather known as chocolate box paintings because they're delightful to look at and maybe as sweet as a lovely chocolate, but they're not maybe by art historians considered very serious paintings, or they don't take the history of art very far forward, but they're quite delightful in their own way, and of course do often exhibit very, very high dexterity and high skill as painters. So I hope that's given you a little bit of a background into wintry painting, which started with Bruegel, and I just again end it with Holman Hunt and the Triumph of the Innocence. So it's a period rich in the winter provides many great subjects, and the seasons and the festivals of this period provide many great subjects for Victorian painters. And I hope I've taken you on a little journey. So if you get a Christmas card with a snowy scene on it, and it appears to be from the Victorian era, you can bet that some of these artists knew about these things, and you might even get a Millais Christmas Eve painting or a Farquharson painting, and you might see a little bit more in it now.